Hello, everybody. My name is Sarah Holman, and I'm the Clinical Product Marketing Director here at Riverside Insights. I'd like to thank you for taking time today to join us for our session, hear from your peers, an interactive discussion around best practices in bilingual assessment. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Corinna Cole. Dr. Cole is an associate professor at Sam Houston State University, the Bilingual Educational Diagnostician Program Coordinator, Director of Appraisal and Diversity at the Garrett Center on Transition and Disability Studies, past president of the Texas Educational Diagnostician Association, and director of the Bilingual Assessment Leadership Group. We are very excited to welcome you today. I have a few questions to get us started, but please leave any questions you may have in the Q&A box. A recording of today's conversation and certificate of attendance will be sent to all registrants by the end of the week. The recording from our previous webinars can also be found on our website at info.riversideinsights.com/clinicalpd. So let me get us started. Welcome, Dr. Cole. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Oh, good. We're super excited for this discussion. I know it's going to be a lively one. To get us sort of started while people sort of get adjusted and logged on and formulate their questions, can you talk about sort of what the most important thing or important things are that evaluators who conduct EL assessments need to know, sort of generally, and then maybe even more specifically if you want to?
Yeah, we can start talking. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me here. I thought I was going to be able to see faces, and I feel that I'm just talking to myself, so hopefully you will start writing questions quickly so that I can address those questions. We have been dealing with how do we test emergent bilinguals. We have been dealing with this dilemma, for a very, very long time. And then thinking about what is the most important thing that we can do. It's like we need to get everything, do everything correctly. I know that there are a lot of different practices that maybe will take us to the same place, but I am a firm believer, and I also try to teach this in my classes at Sam Houston State University, that if we approach everything with a common sense approach, why should we do this first? Why should we do this second? And why is it important for the evaluation of these children that we do certain things first, second, and third? And what are the specific things that we have to look at when we're conducting an evaluation of emergent bilinguals, English learners, culturally and linguistically diverse children? My expertise and my emphasis is usually on children who are English learners, in the sense that they are, Spanish, that Spanish is their native language. So we also teach, and we also address the needs of children who have different native languages. But for the most part, because we are here in Texas and we are actually preparing educational diagnosticians at our university, we have a graduate certificate that provides them at the end of their coursework with us not only the opportunity to go take the test, the Texas 253, to become educational diagnosticians, but we also have a graduate certificate that says bilingual educational diagnosticians, English, Spanish. So we prepare educational diagnosticians to address specifically this question: what is the most important thing? We need to know about language and culture. That's why we feel that it's very important that people who join our program are bilingual teachers, because they have already been tested in the native language. They already passed that test that specifically says that you are a bilingual teacher, that you know the language that you're teaching in this case Spanish, and that you also know the culture of the child. I'm not saying that everyone has to go through a program like this, because I didn't go through a program like this. I was the product of going through the program in English. Then I obtained my educational diagnostician certification, and then I attended, I mean, I always say this, I attended the University of Criselda Guajardo Alvarado. She used to have all these meetings with us, and she taught us how to look at the evaluation from that perspective of what do you do for bilingual children? What do you do differently? One thing that I really hear people saying, that parents sometimes do not want their children to be tested in Spanish, for example. But one thing to know is that when parents give permission to have their children tested in special education, they are not giving you permission to be so that the child gets tested in English or tested in Spanish. Remember that the law indicates that we need to test a child in the native language or other mode of communication if we cannot test the child using language. So that means that we need to get to whatever we need to, the knowledge or the testing needs to be conducted, not necessarily only in one language, but if you cannot find any instrument in the language, native language of the child, you need to find ways, maybe using interpreters. When it's clearly not feasible to conduct the evaluation in the language of the child, you have to find other ways, using of interpreters or using a nonverbal test, or we're not going to get into those type of detailed minutia today because we don't have time. But another thing that I wanted to focus on is also that the law tells us, the final regulations tell us that the child should be tested. The tests should be administered, if possible, in the native language of the child. But they opened it up to in testing in, for example, in English. We used to, a long time ago when I started doing the testing, it has to be done in the native language of the child. And then we always said, oh, we can't do it in English because that's not going to yield appropriate information. But now the law says that that all the tests should be administered. I always forget this. It's in the form that will yield the best information, the most accurate information. So it could be that an emergent bilingual child already has made the transition into English, and then you're going to test this child in both languages, English and Spanish, but most of the information that will yield the best information for you to make a decision will be using the English results. I know I'm really long-winded. I don't know if any other questions.
Yeah, we do have some questions coming in. The first question is, what measures or information should be used to determine the dominant language?
Okay, so I've always thought about this deal with the language, the dominant language, or I'd rather use the word more proficient language. The dominance issue becomes, I may be more dominant in my native language depending on the circumstances, or in English depending on their circumstances. And I know that's the language that we use in our papers, and we have to complete all this fill in all this information in the forms that we have in school, and the papers do say, what is the dominant language. But I want you to think about the abilities of the child. So I want you to think about not necessarily which language is more dominant, but which language is more proficient. So we should always test language proficiency through formal and informal means, in both languages or three languages. Sometimes children have more than two languages. Many of our children who come from Central America, South America, they come from places in their countries where their native language is an indigenous language, is not even Spanish. So we have to like try to get to that. Okay, what are the abilities? What is the level of ability that the child has in either in both languages, and then try to compare those abilities, because to me that's the beginning of the evaluation. You have to have that information in order for you to make an informed decision of where you're going to go for, what are you going to use for achievement testing and what are you going to use for cognitive testing. So we need to investigate everything about the child's second language acquisition. We need to find out in order to make that comparison. We need to know when the child acquired the language, the second language. For example, in my case, I was 10, 11 years old when I arrived in this country. And then I already had my language, my native language was pretty cemented. But some children are born in this country, but they might as well be born like I was born in Colombia. But sometimes their community, the experience is that they don't leave their home and community until they go to school, and that's sometimes the first time that they're confronted with the English language. So that age of acquisition is very important for us to know, when is it that they acquired and they confronted and they were exposed to the second language. What type of bilinguals are they? So that kind of comes together with the concept of when did they acquire it. If they acquire the two languages simultaneously, the types of difficulties, let's say, or the way that the child is going to exhibit behaviors is different. The way we act when we are simultaneous bilinguals or we are sequential bilinguals, like I was, that I had already a native language and then I just put everything I learned of the second language, I put it on top. There are some advantages and disadvantages. As you can see, I have an accent, so that I couldn't get rid of, I don't know, and maybe I don't have a very good ear, because some people, I've heard so many people that come to this country and they learn the English language and they barely have an accent. And I was pretty young, but I still have this accent. So there are things that happen when you're a simultaneous and you're a sequential bilingual. And sometimes when you know that and when you have a chance to explain to teachers that, well, maybe those mistakes that the child is making in the spelling, they're not necessarily errors, like that you have to be really worried about. They are a product of being a bilingual, being an emergent bilingual student, because that's what you hear. Like I have a terrible time hearing all the different sounds of the vowels. And, I always, in my presentations for dyslexia assessment, I'm like, I'm always talking about we have 5 vowels, you have 5 vowels in English, and then we only have 5 sounds in Spanish for those 5 vowels, and each vowel is the sound of the vowel. In English, it's the name of the vowel is not the sound of the vowel. A is the name of A, and then you say, but it sounds like apple, ah. So then in Spanish it's the same. You say ah is ah. Anywhere you put it in the word. So when you know that the things that may happen when you're a bilingual student learning a new language, learning your new language, then that gives you an explanation. Oh, I shouldn't really be worried, because maybe if I concentrate too much on the fact that we do not know how to pronounce the th, the Siri, every time I talk on the phone, or I tell Siri, every time I say a word that should be she thinks that I'm saying the letter D. So she writes things that are not exactly what I'm saying. So those are the kinds of things that we need to pay attention, and we need to know whether the child is a simultaneous or sequential bilingual. Another really, really important thing is that we need to know what the history of the child's language of instruction. Sometimes I call our emergent bilingual students their accidental students. It depends. It depends on whether or not there's a language, an appropriate language program in their schools. Maybe they're in a rural area that does not have a bilingual program, so they get included in general education, and that's by accident. So that doesn't mean that they're in general education because they didn't need bilingual education. It's just because there was no bilingual education available. Sometimes they start in English only programs, and then the parents think that they're having difficulties, and then they put them in the bilingual program, and then they have more difficulties in the bilingual program, so they go back to the English only program. So sometimes we see that fluctuation of 1 year here, 1 year there, and then some people even think, okay, so would this be lack of educational opportunity? Because if our referrals are driven by the problems that the children are having in the educational setting, they're not learning how to read. So is it because they've been into all these different types of programs, 1 year here, 1 year there? So that language of instruction is very, very important, and the type of educational program. So again, look at the history, look at how that may impact the way that they are. Maybe they're doing great in math and they can't read, but is it because they're trying to read, let's say, adopt, or they've been taught how to read in English for 1 year, and then Spanish reading instruction is so different. So it's not an easy task. And then again, the time in the program. How long have the children been in the bilingual program or dual language? Dual language programs are bilingual programs, by the way. Some people say, they think of them as not being bilingual, but a dual language program incorporates the two languages, no, the English and the Spanish. If done, like I've seen it done correctly, it's a wonderful thing, because you acquire the two languages, and children of the two different language backgrounds can indeed become fully bilingual at the end of their school experience. But one thing that I want to really emphasize, and I don't know how many of you have heard of the term TransLanguaging. I went to a conference in Ireland this summer. It was a literacy conference, and many people in Europe are now dealing with immigration problems, with people from different places immigrating into their countries, and then also with the dilemma of they don't know the language of the home country. But this tendency of looking at children that, like sometimes I see the tendency here in the United States that we want them to learn English as quickly as possible. And when they reach that threshold, then we just want to forget about, oh, okay, yeah, they did speak Spanish at one time, or sometimes we don't even know if they spoke that language. They barely meet that threshold, and then we just want to forget about the other part. And I really am a strong proponent that I know that we have a lot of testing. I know that educational diagnosticians and LSSPs and SLPs and everyone who deals with testing our emerging bilingual children, it's like, okay, so now you're telling me I have to test in English, test in Spanish, even though they've reached that fluency level that we can use to determine whether or not they have a disability. So my argument about looking at the whole child and using that perspective, the translanguaging, taking into account every aspect of my language repertoire. Don't forget that I was that little girl that had all that knowledge in my native language when I came to the United States. So if you only looked at my English abilities, you're not getting the whole picture. And sometimes you can get a picture that is not maybe I do look like I have a learning disability because you haven't really looked at all the strengths that I have in my native language. So always think about that. I mean, that's one of my biggest propositions to any evaluator of emergent bilingual children, to test as much as you can in both languages, not to do it just because, but to gain all of the information that you need in order to make a really, really good determination. Another thing that really baffles me is that all of a sudden the child gets referred in 4th grade, and many bilingual dual language programs just go up to 3rd grade. There was never a problem when the child was in bilingual education up to the 3rd grade. They did great. There was never, they had good grades. It was only until they made that transition into the English only program that all of a sudden, voila, they have difficulties. They go through the RTI, program. They get referred for special education. And then someone like me, may come along, or your bilingual evaluators come along, and then they decide to test in both languages because the child was up to 3rd grade. They just made the transition to English. Maybe the LPAC determined correctly that the child could exit, because that's another thing, like when they're in the bilingual ESL programs, there is a way for them to exit. They have to meet a certain criteria to exit those programs. So then all of a sudden they exit and they're in the regular general ed. But what happens is that people don't realize also that they have a monitoring period, that they can always go back to their bilingual education programs if they are having such difficulties that they still need that language program. So that I want you to be aware that all those difficulties that they have when they make that transition, even though in paper they're ready, they may not be that ready. They may need a little bit more time to adjust. And then that's one of the things that I think that RTI, that when we put children through the tier programs, that we need to look at. Another thing is that sometimes the paperwork is there, no? They went through the RTI, everything was done correctly, but then they delivered all of the strategies in the wrong language because they never tested language proficiency. They didn't, the children at that moment, for example, let's say Pablo, a little boy in 3rd grade, they did all the strategies in English, And he failed, of course, because you know, he was having difficulties, nothing worked. And then later they realized the child arrived in the United States a year before. He didn't really have the fluency and the abilities to really benefit from the RTI in English. So think about how many of you in your districts have an RTI in place that takes into account the language instruction and the language needs of the children who are emergent bilinguals. Should I just keep talking or?
No, we have lots of questions, so
Okay.
let's keep going. So one says, there is so much good information that we can obtain from a student interview about their background in relation to language. In your opinion, what are the important questions to ask? Is there a tool that you have come across that provides a good guide to interview the student?
Yeah, it depends on the. I do have some some little questionnaires, and if you guys, you know, this is a plug, a shameless plug about these meetings that we have. I hold workshops, and they're all free. And Rosa Blanco and I uh, followed up, let's say, well, both the BAL, the Bilingual Assessment Leadership Group meetings that started with Chris Alvarado, we have continued those. But then on Saturdays, maybe I think it's like 7 Saturdays a year, we hold these workshops. And we talk about things like that. So if you're interested, you can look me up in the Sam Houston State University, or you can, I don't know if you have my email here, but anyway, I just want to mention that because we address all of those type of things, you know, like how do you interview a child? How do you, sometimes if they're older and then you're wanting to test them in English, I mean, in their native language, they just don't want to. They have made the transition in their mind. They're like, they're not going to answer anything in the native language. They don't want to be different. But there are questions, you know, that are very valid, just the same as for the parents. We have language questionnaires that are more than just what is the language that you speak in the home, and what is the language that, kind of like the home language survey type of questions. We have these long questionnaires. Who do you speak in English with at home? How much, you know, who else lives in your home that speaks this or that language? Because when we're bilinguals and we live in a household where everybody is learning the language, or maybe the daddy is English only, the mommy's Spanish only, then the blending of the languages. So you'll have so many different answers from children. One thing that I really pay attention to is their preferences. I still have to test in the other language, for example, but if the child is really resistant, then I'll test them in the language that they're more comfortable with, and then I'll try to negotiate, you know, like, well, I still have to test you, I still have to ask you in this other language, but it's not, they're always afraid sometimes that you're going to put them back in bilingual ESL, and parents also. They looked at us like, oh, I've already been there, I don't want to I don't want to go back to bilingual ESL. So I hope that answers your question. And we do have a live binder that we share with everyone, and I can go ahead and give you that information at the end. And we'll try, I think we have some of those questionnaires there. Anything that comes our way, we put it there to disseminate it to anyone who's interested in bilingual evaluations.
I did go ahead and post your email in the chat for
Okay.
people, and then we can get that link to the live binder as well to participants.
Okay, perfect.
Let's see. Several questions about specific evaluations or specific assessments that you use. Cognitive and language assessments for kinder evaluations or probably our younger kiddos. And then a question about a specific auditory or phonological test in English and Spanish.
Yes, so those are great questions. And we usually, what I, the test kits, for example, that we cover in our program are basically the Woodcock Johnson oral language for English and Spanish, you know, just for that language proficiency part. The only problem with Spanish, it only has one test, the picture vocabulary, and that's the one that will yield the information about oral expression. So I would rather go to the Woodcock Munoz language survey because that one yields the two clusters, one for oral expression and one for listening comprehension. And it has a test that it's really that it's really appropriate, like for little children, you know, before, instead of having them read because they can't read yet, you show them a little picture, and what they're having to do is they have to tell a story or tell something about the picture. So this addresses kind of like that dyslexia component that children can't read and they can't make that phonemic awareness, the phonological awareness, those connections with the sounds and the symbols, but they have good vocabulary and they can tell a story. So the WMLS serves to me two purposes sometimes, because I can get more information about things like that. We do the TAPS 3 and the TPAS, and let me go ahead and open something here so that I can tell you tell you exactly. So we have, for example, in English, we have the CTOP, no? In English. But in Spanish, we need to have an equivalent, and not, sometimes we can give the tests in English because the students are already at a level where they can handle English tests. But the problem with some of the children is that they need to be tested in the native language. And for the, let me give you the exact name, the test of auditory processing skills, which is the TAPS 3, that's a bilingual test. And it's bilingual in the sense, it's for bilingual children. And it is a test that does the, excuse me a second, I'm trying to, so that I can give you exactly here the test. For example, it has a word discrimination test, it has a phonological segmentation test, and a phonological blending test. So you get those components of the phonological segmentation and then the phonological blending. So at least we have something in Spanish that can help us with that, to compare maybe if we were able to give them the CTOP in English. So how did they do with the CTOP? How do they do in Spanish with the TAPS 3? The other test that we recommend is the TPAS. And the TPAS is the test of phonological awareness in Spanish. And then the only thing, not going so much into all of the intricacies of the test, is that the TPAS is an older test, and but it does go into that phonological awareness, and I don't have the protocol here. But it is, so at least we have those two instruments for that part of the assessment, where we need to look at, can they make those connections. And in Spanish, you would be you wouldn't be surprised necessarily, as you can as we know about the transparency of the language and the opaqueness of English versus to how transparent Spanish is. We do not necessarily, we're not surprised necessarily at the results that we obtain in this type of tests. Sometimes we just don't have the tests or the instruments in Spanish. And with Rosa Blanco, we have several presentations that we have done. And what we do is we look at what instruments we have in English, like the C-top, because we don't really have rapid automatized naming test only in Spanish. So, you know, the rapid number naming and the rapid letter naming in the C-top. So what we do is we give you kind of like instructions or suggestions on how to test the limits in the language in Spanish. So you give the test in English, you score it, and then later, after you've already done that part, then you do the test in Spanish. So what this accomplishes is that you can make a comparison between the performance of the child in English and the performance of the child in Spanish. The only thing is that you don't score the test in Spanish. Because all you're going to do is a qualitative comparison of how they responded. Even though the name, what do you call it, the calling out of the numbers when we say them in Spanish, they may take a little longer because they have more syllables. But when a native Spanish, sometimes the difference in how long it takes them, it's not that marked, because if you're a fluent Spanish speaker, then you rattle them off in Spanish. But that is something that people point out, that most of the numbers in English are one syllable, and most of the numbers in Spanish, the digits when you call them out, their names have more than one syllable. So there are ways in which we can test using testing the limits, using informal, extending the test, and going back and testing in Spanish. But you always have to qualify that in your report. And really about this specific issue, but I will tell you about this right now, otherwise I'll forget. Sometimes when you do this type of evaluation, that okay, I gave the test in English because that's the test, the language of the child, and the child barely speaks any Spanish, but the child just completely just got a very, very low score. And then, for example, you're looking at the determination whether the child has an intellectual disability or not. When you go back and test the limits, and then maybe explain to the child what the test was asking for. I know that this is you already have your scores. You already have to have that report that is going to express the scores that you obtain. You're not going to change any scores. But then you have a very good explanation in which you can say, after I explained to the child, because I followed all the rules for the how do you call that? the administration, excuse me. I followed all the rules for the administration of the test, and the child obtained this score. But then later, I went and explained, each step of the way to see if the child, would really understand. And I know this is not something that we need to do, but sometimes, all the time, but we need to do it when we're making a call that we're saying that a child has an intellectual disability, and we have a suspicion that maybe the parent didn't really understand what they were answering when they were doing their adaptive behavior, responding to the adaptive behavior scales. They use whatever knowledge they had. They speak Spanish, but they don't read it very well. They speak English, but they don't read it or understand it that well. So sometimes we have those dilemmas. So what I'm saying is that sometimes it is very beneficial to go back and really make sure that the child just didn't understand, they didn't understand because of their intellectual deficits, or they didn't understand because of the presentation of the test. So for younger kids, for example, and for English learners, emergent bilinguals, I recommend the use of the KBC. The KBC has been normed. We have that normative update. A lot of people think that the test looks really old, but it's a much better alternative to other tests that are, very verbally loaded, like the bateria and the WJs. Now, the WISC, and the WISC is in Spanish. And although it does have a little bit of a dilemma also, because it was meant and it was normed on children who were recent arrivals. And we have children here that we administer to that are not recent arrivals. That's why you have to really look at the manuals and then see what is the best fit for each test for the child that you're testing. But what I like about the WISC is that it gives the child more opportunities to go from a 0 response, if it has a query, go up to perhaps a 1 or a 2 or a perfect score. So it depends. It depends. We have different presentations that we have in our live binder that kind of take you, this is the case study, and this is what we did, and these were the recommendations. So if you join our workshops, we do a lot of those activities. Okay, let me have another question, because I'm talking too much and I don't know if I have covered any.
Let me see. Can you please elaborate on dyslexia assessment of emergent bilingual students? Should we be testing in both languages when the student is equally proficient in both languages?
Definitely. I advocate for testing, like I said before, that about the translanguaging and all the strengths and weaknesses that the child may have in both languages. And especially with dyslexia, it may be that so what happens with dyslexia and emergent bilinguals in Spanish is that some of the characteristics are not the common characteristics. Usually in Spanish, what is mostly affected is the fluency of the child, because we remember what I said, everything is a direct connection. The letters are named, the way they sound, that's the way we read them, that's the way, so there's really in that phonemic awareness part, in that phonetic coding, our children are not going to make that many mistakes. It's like, oh wow, they can read. That's why we get overlooked sometimes, because yeah, we can read, but the problem becomes is on how fluently do we read, and that's where we catch them. Because if the child can read, we read and we teach how to read and we learn to read, putting together the vowels with the consonants, and then we go to the syllables, M with A, M with E, ma, me, mi, mo, mu, pa, pe, pi, po, pu. So we can read those, we can put them together. So we have a word with 3 syllables, mañana, we can read it. But the problem is when children are reading those strings of words, those lines of words, they get stuck because they can read each syllable, but by the time they get to the end of the line, they don't remember what they read, and what they're reading is syllables in isolation. So that's one of the differences, one of the main characteristics. And there have been studies between transparent languages like in Italian and Turkish, and people who have studied this say that the fluency is the main difference. Not that the children don't have difficulties also in that phonemic awareness and and putting together the sounds with the syllables. I mean, the sounds with the symbols, but it's mainly with the fluency part. The way we teach how to read. That's why those of you who are familiar with like Esperanza and then the Wells, Dr. Cardenas Hagen developed Wells too, which is a way to teach Spanish the same way that we teach English. So if you have the same type of approach, then it's going to be easy to bridge when you make that transition from your native language of Spanish to English. So we, for example, don't put so much emphasis on rhyming, the cat in the hat, and we don't have that type of emphasis in Spanish in the rhyming. So the approach has a lot to do with the differences in the way we look at the child who has dyslexia in English and Spanish. So I would recommend, unless the child is the fluency levels are so much higher in English. So that would be the determination in whenever you're doing all of, like I can't tell you like there's a perfect formula. But every step of the way, you're saying, oh, okay, well, he's more fluent in English. He's been instructed in English longer. That's the other question. Let's say you have a child who has equal proficiency in both English and Spanish. Her abilities are pretty much the same in the way they understand language and the way they speak the language. But then they have never been instructed in their native language. They've never received any formal instruction in Spanish as far as reading and as far as doing any academics. So for me, why would it make sense to exhaustively test every area of achievement in that language if the child has never received instruction? And if the child has been referred for deficits in, obviously they're in English. So we do like a screener. We do a little bit of reading, like a letter word identification in Spanish. We do dictation, and then we do applied problems. So those will give us an idea of whether or not the child also has deficits in the native language. But it is case by case. It is really, really something that is difficult to determine. So the answer is, I don't know what the answer is. It depends. It depends.
That's the answer in a lot of these cases, I think.
Oh, I know. One thing that I wanted to, I know we're running out of time. I hate this. I always run out of time, but I wanted to tell you that some of the things that you have to collect to information about language for the child, not only, you know, what do they speak at home, what instructional placements that they have had. Look at the home language survey, but that's just a little snapshot of how they began the history of their language in school. Then go ahead and look at the LPAC. The LPAC information, that's very, it should be very rich with information. And the LPAC sometimes, depending on the school district, it can guide you and give you a recommendation. They recommend that the child be tested. They don't think that the child fits the profile of an English learner that doesn't have, it seems that the child is having tremendous difficulties. If they are still at the beginning level, in most of the areas, you know, the listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and they're at the beginning level and they're in 5th grade, you know, that's showing that the child is having tremendous difficulties acquiring English. But remember that the TELPAS results are only charting the progress of the English language. And the LPAC, I don't think in many schools, it no longer tests in both English and Spanish. So that language proficiency testing that you have to conduct in English and in Spanish, it falls into the lap of the bilingual evaluator. And I would rather do it myself than get some results that maybe were administered, these tests were administered by people who may not be as highly trained as I am or as people in special education. Okay, that was my other little soapbox.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Okay.
What are your views on allowing the student to answer in both their languages and recording the correct one? So I believe we shouldn't be limiting the linguistic repertoire of the student to just one language.
Oh, I definitely agree with the concept, but I think that we are bound by the rules of the test. So that's a huge, very important factor. And that's why I always say, write the answer. Some tests will allow you to count those as correct. Or some tests will allow you to say, oh, tell me in the other language. But I know what the question is. I know that all of a sudden, if I counted every answer correct, depending on the language that the child answered, the child would look great. But then I have to follow the instructions of the test. And I have to, my goodness, give them that score of 70 or, and it kills us. But that's why you're going to take notes. And when you report that score, you say, however, every time the child responded in the native language, it was a correct answer, or it was the equivalent of a correct answer. So that's why I say that if this happens when you're doing cognitive testing, no longer are we allowed in the bateria or the WJ to take answers in English and Spanish. And that's terrible because we were so used to having that opportunity. But that doesn't mean that a child who answers half and half and only gets half of the answers correct, that child has an intellectual disability, because, you know, there is an explanation. That's the explanation that I was giving in my previous example, that if you do that qualitative explanation and say, however, that big however is going to have to say however 10 exclamation points. But do not break the rules of the test, because that is a test that was normed in a certain way, and you will get to go before a hearing officer. I'm just kidding, maybe not, but they'll ask you, did you read the manual? Do you know that you cannot give points if the child answers in this or that language? However, again, I say some tests do allow you to give them credit if they answer in the other language. But my heart is with you. Whoever asked that question, I know exactly how we feel about that. Oh my goodness, we're running out of time. We have 3 minutes.
We do. And I just wanted to reassure everyone that we recognize that we did not get to all of the questions. I will work with Dr. Cole to get some follow-up, as well as send out the link to the live binder. I think that's probably the easiest way to do it, is to do it in a follow-up email.
Yes, we can.
Unless you have it.
We can put this in the live binder, and then you can help me write the book.
Oh.
If you're interested, hey, come on, be part of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. There is one question: the tests that allow for dual answers. I know the BVAT does allow for answers in multiple languages.
Yes.
I think the KBC allows some as it is sort of prescribed in the administration manual.
Yes, and that's exactly, it's like we used to have in the WJ and the bateria, but yeah, the KBC specifically gives you you can give correct answers. But I think that the question alluded to test kits that do not provide you that opportunity.
Right,
But
right.
we have, I think we were creating a document that had, we have a document, like not a cheat sheet, but an explanation of every test, almost every test in the market, in the live binder.
Okay, well, we will work to make sure that everybody gets the link to that live binder, as well as answers to the questions that we did not get to today. So I do want to thank you so much for your time. This was incredibly informative, very interesting discussion. Obviously a topic that is very complex and no simple answers are involved. But again, thank you so much. Thank you to our attendees for coming. We're out of time, unfortunately, but again, we will work to get you the answers to those questions, as well as the live binder. And be sure to stay tuned for other professional development opportunities.
Well, thank you very much for your interest. Yes.
Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, no, thank you for your interest, because this is very dear to my heart, and we are available, and we should be getting together and discussing this more often. This is how we get the answers.
Exactly. Collaboration is key.
There you go.
Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you. Do you want me to stay, or do I leave?
I think Neha is going to end the recording.